This morning, we're going to continue in a series. It's just been neat to see how the Lord's bringing this about. If I could whisper one thing, if somebody could whisper one thing out of the Bible, what would that one thing be? Now, first of all, there's a lot of things that people would whisper out of the Bible. Last week, we talked about Hagar and finding out what do you do when you find yourself in dry places and it just seems like you don't know where God wants you to go. Today, we're going to talk about David and dealing with some giants, but in the coming weeks, we're going to deal with learning what it means to cry out and don't miss opportunities and live with the end in mind. What is it that people in the Bible would want to whisper? Matthew 10:27 says, "What I tell you in the darkness, speak it in the light, and what you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim it on the housetops." If you're going to speak what God whispers, that means we need to be listening to what God says. Do you agree with me on that? Amen. One person agreed. Let's pray. Jesus, help. What God whispers, we need to proclaim. So we have to be listening. And this morning I want to talk to you about a man named David. I believe David could whisper a lot of things to us. I believe, he could whisper to us about shepherding, what it means to lead a company, lead a business. He could speak to us about Bathsheba and tell us some pitfalls to avoid, why not to go down that road. He could talk to us about the battles that he's faced, strategy, military. He could talk to us about what it means to be a king, because he was King David, and what it means to lead a kingdom. He could talk to us about father-son relationships, because after all, he had a son that was trying to kill him and go after him. But I believe the greatest opportunity, the greatest lesson that he would want to whisper to us this morning would come from the story of David and Goliath, because at a very young age, he learned early on how to deal with situations in life that taunted him and mocked him. I believe if David could whisper one thing, it would simply be this: do you see what I see? And you may say, well, it's kind of a stupid title. What do you mean by that? I'm glad you asked. Do you see what I see? What is it that David saw that he would whisper to us and say, do you see what I see? Because there's things that David faced. So as we talk about David and Goliath, understand there's something that he wants to deposit in our lives. Because I believe that as we talked last week about being in dry places, if you've ever been in a dry place, once it's no longer dry, we're so excited. But the very next thing that usually happens is the giants show up. And they want to knock you and I out. So what do you do when the giants show up? I got a little video. Wouldn't you just love to see the giants in your life go down like that? They stand and mock you. They laugh at you with that gravelly voice that just makes you want to punch them if you could get up high enough. And they just seem to taunt you and mock you. And what do you do when you're facing giants like that? I want to get right to the source of what's taking place here, because I believe this. I believe that many of us have giants in our lives. Have you ever had a giant in your life that was mocking you like that, telling you what you can't be? You'll never amount to anything. You'll never be free. You'll always stay addicted. You'll never have success. You'll never find joy. That's what giants do in life. They mock you and taunt you and tell you what you will never have. You see, if you're here today and I said, have you ever faced that giant? Most of us might say yes, but on the off chance somebody would say, no, Pastor, I don't think I have any giants in my life. Au contraire, mon frère. We have an enemy called the devil who wants to steal, kill, and destroy. He wants to knock us out so we don't ever experience the promises of God. So, if you know that you've had a giant in your life, if you have a giant in your life, or if one of them are waiting for you out in your car right now, we need to find out, what does God have to say? What did David see that we need to see? So when a giant starts to mock us, we can look at him and say, my God's bigger than you. How do we get to that place? When I talk about a giant, I mean this, and I believe it's in your outlines. By a giant, I mean a giant is a problem or a person that looms so large that it intimidates you and causes you to fear. Have you ever been afraid? Sure. All of us have been afraid. We face that in our lives. Israel is afraid right now. In 1 Samuel 17, I'm going to read to you verses 24 and 26, and I'm going to jump over to verse 31. It says that all the men of Israel saw the man, Goliath. They fled from him. They were greatly afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he's coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him. and great riches will be given to him and his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, well, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Verse 31. When the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. Saul said to David, you're not able to go out and fight this Philistine, for you're but a youth, while he's been a warrior since his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard. I struck him and I killed him. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. Oh my. And this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. There's something great that's going on here. And you'll notice in your outline, we're going to jump around to a lot of verses, but we're hanging out in 1 Samuel 17 because there's something that we can learn here about dealing with giants in our lives. Are you sick of living life being giant-led? Or at least that's what it feels like. You know, God's number one, and you love him, and he loves you, but do you ever feel like there's this giant, there's this addiction, there's this habit, there's this thought process, there's this system that just functions, and it seems to sometimes short-circuit God's best for your life. And then that giant mocks you and taunts you and says, oh, I told you you could never do it. You're such a failure. You'll never succeed. You see, Israel's in this situation where they don't know what to do. It says in verse 4 that in the Philistines, it says a champion came out from amongst the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, who was standing at 6 cubits in a span. Now that just sounds pretty intimidating, doesn't it? Goliath from Gath. I mean, that just sounds bad. This guy sounds like he's just ready to rip somebody up one side and then down the other. 9 foot 9 inches tall is what he is. That's a big dude. That's a tall man. Not only was he tall, but he was strong, he was imposing, and he was taunting the armies of the living God. So Goliath, 9 foot 9, he was an intimidating giant. We know that because in the Bible it says in verse 11 that Saul and all of Israel heard the words of the Philistines, and they were greatly afraid. It says in verse 24, when all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him because they were greatly afraid. Have you ever been greatly afraid? I'm talking God says do this, but you look at whatever it is he said, and you're afraid. It happens. We become scared. I don't know if I can do it. The answer is you can't without him. They became afraid. This Goliath was intimidating, and Goliaths will come in all shapes and sizes. They will come in all scenarios and forms of life. You might have a Goliath job right now that you work at. You may have a Goliath roommate. You may have a Goliath mate. You may have a Goliath school situation. You may have a Goliath lawsuit or a disaster or an illness. And it's so big that it causes you to be afraid. If it brings fear, that is a giant in our lives. Well, this is Israel's situation. Goliath stands and he mocks the armies of the living God. He stands there day after day. Goliath says in verse 8 and 9 that he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said, why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine and you, servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down here. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail, then you shall become my servants and serve us. See, this is how, basically what he was saying was this. Winner takes all. You pick your bestie, we'll pick our bestie, and they're going to fight. And whoever wins, they are the champion. And they would do this a lot. You know, when I was a kid, how many of you guys enjoyed watching the Winter Olympics? Do you guys like that? How many of you are more Summer Olympics? You like those better than winter? Who likes winter more than summer? Winter's fun just because they're crazy. I mean, they're all crazy. Flipping and all the snowboards and skis and alpine skiers and ski jumps. And when I was a kid and I watched the Olympics, I used to dread those times in life. You know why? I misunderstood something. I used to think that when the Olympics were going on, whoever won the Olympics ruled the world. That's what I thought. Now, yeah, it's humorous now, but when you're a kid and you're watching the Olympics, come on, USA, come on. Russia would win one. You'd be like, no, we're going to go into dictatorship and it's going to be horrible. And I used to think that's why we did the Olympics. Whoever wins the Olympics rules the world. Do you know that what was happening is this? Goliath says, you pick one person, we'll pick one person. And we will fight representatively, and whoever wins, wins. Whoever loses serves the winner. It's kind of like the Super Bowl that we had here recently. The Seattle Seahawks won. How? I don't know, but they won. And you know what happened? All the Seattle Seahawks fans, you know what they did? We won the Super Bowl. We won the You didn't win anything. You sat at home eating popcorn, watching it on TV. You didn't win a Super Bowl. They're like, no, we won it representatively. You won it. Your team went out there and won the game. You sat on the couch. You didn't win anything. That's what's going on here, and this was common practice, was to pick one person from each side to go in to do battle. They have Goliath, and he's calling them out. He's taunting them, and it's an interesting thing about a giant. A giant that knows it's a giant intimidates you perpetually. Do you know what I mean by that? Perpetually, constantly, ongoing, never giving up. Never going to stop reminding you of what a failure you are and how you can't do it. It will continue for a long time. And it says in verse 10 that the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And the Philistines came forward. It says in verse 16, morning and evening for 40 days. 40 days. Did you catch that? 40 days. Have you ever had giants in your life that for 40 days, every day when you got up, reminded you of what you can't do? Reminded you of how you failed, how you probably will fail again. 40 days, this giant showed up twice a day and mocked them and taunted them. So he's defying them. I don't know about you, but when those giants show up, you just want to say, shut up. But it really doesn't do any good, does it? They still keep coming. They still keep showing up. And this giant will not leave them alone. You ever have giants that don't leave you alone? It's rough having giants that won't leave you alone. They're bigger than you. They're stronger than you. They're more experienced than you. And you may say, well, I don't have any giants in my life. I think we cleared that up. We got one called the devil. He wants to steal, kill, and to destroy. So you do have a giant. When you look at Goliath, you see the enemy behind him. And that giant that stands in front of you, if you look at that giant, you're going to see the enemy behind that. Because he wants to bring destruction. So the question that was on my heart this morning was this: why does God allow giants? I didn't get that. Maybe I still don't all the time. But why does he allow these giants in our lives? God could have killed Goliath. I mean, he's God, right? God can do anything. You guys agree with that? Okay. So why didn't he? Why didn't he just kill Goliath? Why didn't he make him disappear? Why didn't he turn him into, a 2-foot, 2-inch sissy girl with the ballerina outfit? I mean, we can take that. He could have done any of that, but no, he let 9'9" of ugly stand there and mock the armies of the living God. Why does God allow those giants in our lives to stand there and do the same thing? You see, when you have a giant that God allows in your life, know this: first of all, God's in control, okay? You've got to know that. God knows what's going on. He's not watching TV and going, oh, you got a giant. Be right there. He doesn't do that. He knows exactly what's going on. When you have a giant and God allows it in your life, what God has allowed is an opportunity for you to see the size of your giant against the backdrop of the size of your God. You don't know how big God is until you need him in that moment. And many times when we see the giant always looks bigger than the God that we serve and we love. And that's usually because we're not as close to our God as we should be. Because the closer you get to God, the bigger you'll see he is. And he will then, that giant, turn into a 2-foot, 2-inch sissy in a ballerina outfit. Because your God is so big, your God is so good, your God is so strong. But if we're not by him, if we're not near him, if we're not drawing near unto him, why are we so surprised when it seems like God doesn't show up? God's there. The question is where are we? The perspective of our giant gives us an understanding, because if you're a little kid and you look to an adult, they look like a giant. Is the adult really a giant? No, the child's just so small. Because the child will grow and eventually go, you're not as big as I thought you were. As a matter of fact, Tooks, where are you at? That guy, he picks me up and swings me around by my shoulders. He used to be a little kid. Now, I look at him and I'm like, hey, Tooks. He's a big boy. He grows. But does that mean that he's the giant? No. God is in control. Many times when we look to the adult, they seem and appear like they're a giant. And many times when we look at the giants in our life, they appear to be bigger than anything else, even God himself. But that's not the truth. That's not reality. So we have to ask this question that David asked this morning when he says, do you see what I see? What is it that David sees? Because whatever it is that David sees, if we can learn that, then we can face any giant that we face in our lives. So how do we learn to do this? Number one, write this down in your outlines. You've got to know this, that your level of fear reveals your proximity to God. The level of fear reveals your closeness or maybe your lack of closeness to God. This is very important when you're facing a giant. If you're facing a giant and you're intimidated by it, it becomes a spiritual education where you are in your proximity to God. The closer you are to God, the less the thing looks like a giant. Saul, he was afraid. King Saul, the guy in charge. He was afraid. Saul was the king, but Saul was also not close to God. And by the way, Saul was the tallest male in Israel. I don't know if you knew that, and you might say, well, who cares? Well, they said, pick for the biggest guy in your group. And who did they get? 5 foot, 10-inch David, shepherd boy. Why didn't King Saul go out there? It says in the Bible that he was elected to his position to be the king because one of the attributes was he was tall in stature. So Saul's a big boy. He's tall. It's all good there. But he was afraid. He was afraid. When Goliath showed up, he wanted to hide. So when your giants are bigger than your God, it's because you're closer to your giants than you are to your God. Enter David. David shows up. David's one of the greatest men of the Old Testament, in my opinion. David's fairly short, 5 foot 10 inches, soaking wet. And he's facing a 9 foot 9-inch giant. David is a young man at this time, but here's the key to David. David, he wasn't impressed at all with what impressed everybody else. He wasn't impressed. Everyone's going, look, there's a giant in the land, and he's going, yeah. He wasn't impressed by that. Why wasn't he impressed by that? Well, there's reasons for it. Everybody else was nervous. Everybody else was trembling. Everybody else was greatly afraid. But David said this, verse 26. David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine? And it takes away the reproach from Israel. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Now, we've got a young boy, and everyone else in the nation's afraid. David wants to know, what will be done for the one who kills this dude named Goliath and takes away this reproach? Please notice that his comparison that David is making is not between Goliath and man, but between Goliath and God. See, anytime you take a giant in your life and compare it to you, you probably will lose. But when you take the giant and you compare it to God, hey, greater is he that's within you than anything in this world. You can have that victory because of who I am? No, absolutely not. Because of who God is in you. Makes all the difference in the world. You may say, well, you know what? He may be taller, Goliath, than everybody else in Israel. He may be more experienced than everyone else in Israel. But when I put him next to God, the dude becomes real small. Next to God. Not only that, but he throws in another zinger here, and he calls him an uncircumcised Philistine. Now, there's a reason for that. And I don't want to bore you with it too much, but the reality is this. Israelite males were circumcised. Don't get hung up on the physical circumcision. You know, he says, you're an uncircumcised Philistine. And you might go, who cares? I mean, what does that have to do? They're getting ready to fight. The males were circumcised in a physical representation of a spiritual reality, a spiritual truth. They were saying that we are God's chosen, and as a part of that, we are setting ourselves aside because what was going on, it was very important for Israel to separate the males by circumcision because it was the seed of the male that was to produce the development of a nation. And as physical representation, they did circumcision, which just meant that spiritually we set ourselves aside for you. We are a special, chosen people. We are a people of promise. So when he looks at them and he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? What he's saying is this, Who is this person who's not a part of the promise? Who's this giant who has no authority, who has no say in our life, but yet wants to mock me and taunt me? He's not a part of the covenant. He's not a part of the promise. But yet you're letting him speak into our lives? I don't think so. See, David saw something different that none of the others saw. All they saw was muscle. All they saw was gruff, fierce, warrior. David looked at him and went, you're not a part of the promise. We've got this. Guys, we've got this. Do you understand? Uncircumcised. Remember? Not a part of the covenant. Not a part of the promise. We don't have to fear. We have to make sure that when we have giants in our lives, we remember it has less to do with who we are and more to do with who God is. And if you ever lose sight of that, the giants become bigger and God becomes smaller. So, David said this. He said, hey, guys, he's not circumcised. In other words, he's not part of this. He's not part of the covenant. He's not part of the people of God. He's not part of the family of God. That automatically reduces him. Wouldn't you just love to see your giants reduced? Then ask yourself this. The giant that mocks you today, is it part of God's promise? Is it part of God's plan? And if the answer is no, your giant is automatically reduced. Number 2, write this down. If we're going to learn to see what God sees, know this. David saw Goliath through spiritual eyes, not through physical attributes. Not through physical attributes. In other words, he looked behind what the physical eyes could see to see what was spiritually there. He's the only one thinking this way, by the way. He's the only one thinking what he's thinking. He's the only one viewing things like he's viewing them. Nobody else is looking at Goliath like David is, because David, when he looks at him through God's eyes and sees what's going on spiritually. Little nugget, let me give this to you. If all you see is what you see, then you don't see all that there is to see. If all you see is what you see with your physical eyes, you'll stop. You'll give up. You'll quit. You'll throw in the towel because it's a giant. But if you see what God sees, then you'll be reminded that your God is greater than any giant that you face. And that's how you'll gain the victory. Don't look at everything just by physical attributes. Gain some spiritual eyes, and you'll see that giant start to be reduced. He said, this man is not circumcised, so that man doesn't have any clout here. And he's making fun of the armies of the living God, and the armies of the living God are scared to death. David, he even takes flack from his family on this. It says in the Bible that his older brother, Eliab, David shows up and basically says, what's going to be done for the one who takes him out? And his older brother, Eliab, says, David, go home. What are you doing down here? You just came down here, you nosy, snot-nosed little brat. Go back there with the sheep and do your job. You're just down here trying to check things out. And David said, I was just asking a question. He starts taking flack from his family here. His own family didn't understand that he was looking at the situation through different eyes. You see, when you develop the habit of looking at the giants in your life with different glasses on, with a different viewpoint, people around you, even the ones that are close to you, may not understand where you're coming from because they may not see what you see. See, if God gives you his eyes, not everybody else will have the same viewpoint. The question is are you going to listen to God? Are you going to see what he sees? Don't be upset when people who only see what they see don't understand what you see, because you're the one seeing it. So here's David, who saw an uncircumcised Philistine, which leads him to some of the greatest statements in the text. Verses 45 and 46. David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. We long for this day, don't we? When you have a giant in your life, you long for the day that head gets lopped off. But it doesn't happen until you gain his eyes and see what he sees. Do you see? He's fighting David, not just he's fighting theologically and spiritually, not just socially or politically. He's gotten to the spiritual root of what's taking place. Now he's prepared to deal with this tub of fruit that's in front of him, okay? The only way he can deal with that giant is when he gets to the root of the matter, when he finds the heart of Christ in the midst of this situation. He says in verse 47, that all this assembly may know, we've heard this many times, that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give it into your hand. He will give you into our hands. The battle is the Lord's, he says, and he is going to give you into our hands. It's going to be a grace gift, is what he's saying. He's saying that when God fights for us, we don't have to do anything except follow him, believe in him, and put our faith in Christ, and know this, that God will deliver you into our hands. So they're getting ready for battle. And you have to understand, David has no experience in wartime, okay? He's taking care of sheep. Sheep are pretty, I don't know a lot about sheep, but I want to learn more. Because they're very interesting how God parallels us to sheep. I'm like, oh, we're fluffy, white, little clean animals. They're not clean. They're not fluffy. I don't know if they're really very nice, but I know they stink. I know that they can get stubborn. I hear that they can be pretty ignorant. And when I hear those definitions of what a sheep is, and then God goes, I love you like little lambs, I'm like, thanks a lot, God. You really value me highly, don't you? And he does. But there's a reason he compares us to that. David doesn't know how to fight. So what do they do? David, you got God's eyes on this? God bless you, son. Nice knowing you. Here. And Saul takes his armor off. You know why Saul takes his armor off and puts it on David? You know why he does that? Because Saul's not going to use it. Saul's not going out there. He's like, you got to be crazy, kid. That guy's 9'9" and ugly. I'm not going out there, Jack, but you can go. You can be the sacrificial lamb. And he puts the armor on him, and David's trying to move around, and he can't. And he says in verse 39 that he says, I can't go with these, for I've not tested them. And David took them off. He took them off. The boy's crazy. He's going to go fight Goliath wearing his little spandexy shorts and whatever and sandals and flip-flops, and he's going to go out there with a bag of rocks and a sling. Are you nuts? We would think so. But we see something that there's something David sees that we, at this point in the story, don't see. Saul gave David what he knew. He said, here's my armor. Here's what I know to do. Here's what I know how to do. But that did not help David one bit. Sometimes when you're facing giants, is it okay to seek counsel and gain wisdom? Yes. But it doesn't mean that that's always the answer. It never replaces the voice of God. Seeking counsel that's wisdom. That is great to do, but you have to make sure that you seek him first. It says in verse 40 that David took a stick in his hand, chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, put it in his bag, and he approached the Philistine. Now David, he knew slingshots, okay? He could do that. As a matter of fact, I brought one today. He knew slingshots. And it doesn't take long for a little boy to get a hold of this, and you're going to have a broken window or a broken something, maybe even us older boys. Because we love slingshots. This is all he knew. Now, this is not the slingshot that David had, okay? I mean, I doubt they had these Nike and Under Armour slingshots back then. So nice like this. But he had a slingshot. And he said, I'm going to take on the giants. And you know what everyone was doing? The same thing we do. You're crazy. You're going to go face Goliath with the slingshot? You want a water gun too, little boy? That's not going to do it. But David saw something that we didn't see. When he gets ready to fight him, it says that he approached and ran out to him quickly. He didn't hesitate. He didn't hold back. And it says that Goliath disdained him. That means, he said, he had no respect for David or who he was or what he stood for. But David approached him, and it says that it happened when the Philistines, verse 48, rose up and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly towards the battle line. I'm just picturing this little boy running with a slingshot in his hand to face 9'9" of ugly. And he approaches the giants. Now, let's get this straight. He's 9'9". Okay? That's tall. Would you agree? It's tall. That's like 1 1/3 of me, height-wise. And you can only imagine his sword and his spear and all that. Look how big this sucker is. That's a big sword. It's kind of heavy to deal with. Now, let's just say that I'm going to give you that. We're going to fight. Ready? Go. How fair is that? It's not very fair. I mean, people can look at this and say, dude, you are like getting serious about this. This is actually Neil Abbott. This is his sword. He collected swords. Neil, part of our church family. He passed away 2 weeks ago. And he had this sword at the visitation. And I called Anita and I said, can I borrow that sword? And I thank you for giving me the doll one because I've been playing with it too much. But I think of this sword and how big this is and how intimidating it can be. I mean, when I hold this sword, it probably doesn't look like it fits me very well at all. You need a much bigger person to deal with a sword this size. And David is approaching him with this, a slingshot. What did David know that we need to know? What is it that David understood? You see, when he faces him with a slingshot in his hand and he starts to approach him, you put it on paper, you put it on a whiteboard, this formula, it is going to come out that David should be a 100% loser. He should fail, he should flop, he can't win unless you're not the one fighting the battle. Unless you understand the battle does not belong to you. It belongs to the Lord. So then let me ask this question. How do you fit into this fight? The answer is that we are to be the vehicle that God uses. I asked myself this question. I'll ask you. Was it David's faith that brought down the Philistine? Or was it David's skill with the slingshot that brought down the Philistine? The answer really is both. It's both. Because David trusted God, but God was still working through something that David knew. You see, when you face a giant in your life, yes, it requires faith. You have to have that faith to trust in the Lord because God is going to use what you know to be able to face the giants that you face in life. Many of us think, well, I just want God to show up and deal with the giant in my life. Can He do that? Yes, He can, but why doesn't He just take care of the Goliaths? Because He's bringing us to a point that as we move in faith, in a relationship with Him, God will take what's in our hand and teach us what it means to face the giants in our life. It says in verse 54 that David took the Philistine's head. He took that sword. When he sunk that rock into his head and the giant fell down, it says that he took Goliath's sword and cut off his head. Chopped his head off. And he brought the head back to the camp of Jerusalem. Why in the world would he do that? So that Israel would have a testimony. Israel could see that when they face another Goliath in their life, they can look at this head that was chopped off and say, if we can accomplish this, we can accomplish more. They'll be reminded that it wasn't about our strength, it was about what God was doing in us and through us. So the next time you face 10-foot, 10-inch ugly, you can remember what happened at 9-foot, 9-inch ugly, and you'll remember that it's all about Him, and greater is He that's with you and me than anything else in this world. You know, it also says that he brought the Philistines' weapon into his tent. I thought that was pretty interesting. He had something for the nation, and he had something for himself. He had a testimony for the nation, but he also had a testimony for himself. And now he can use the enemy's weapons to fight his own battles. In other words, what used to belong to the enemy now belongs to him, so he can now use that for his purposes. Let me tell you why David became king of Israel. David is going to be anointed king of Israel. David becomes king because he's a man of faith. It's because he's a man of faith. The people, they chose Saul. You know why they chose him? Because he looked good. Saul was a man of sight. Saul was a man that was impressive. But God chose David because David was a man of faith. If you're facing a giant and it's bigger than you are, capable of handling, hang out with somebody who has a David mentality. Because when it's giant time, Saul can't help you. Only David can. Because Saul is running with you. David is running towards the giant. We have to have that mentality. Let me close with this. I got a picture up there for you of a solar eclipse. You know what a solar eclipse is? A solar eclipse is when the moon will block the rays of the sunlight from getting to Earth. So what it'll look like is this. You see this big black circle with the sun behind it and just the outer rim of light, and the moon appears to be blocking the sun. The moon appears to be stopping the sun from getting to where we are so we can experience the light. It eclipses the view of the sun and the light coming from the sun. You would think during this time of a solar eclipse that the moon, you would think this, that the moon is bigger than the sun, wouldn't you? I mean, the moon must be bigger than the sun because it's blocking the sun. But that is not what's going on. In reality, it looks like the circle of the moon appears bigger than the circle of the sun because it's blocking it. But in reality, the sun is 1,000 times bigger than the moon. It just looks like the moon's bigger because of our proximity, our location. Where we stand and where we look, the moon appears bigger than the sun. But in reality, the sun is 1,000 times bigger. It looks like the moon, you know what it really is? It's no good for giving light. It's only good for reflecting light. The moon is really a dark place. And you know why it seems this way, like it's bigger than the sun? It seems that way because of our viewpoint and the way that we look at it. This tiny moon covers this huge sun because of our vantage point. It's not reality. It's not bigger than the sun. It's not more powerful than the sun. It's just our perspective. Sometimes our problems can look bigger than our God. They seem to block God out. They seem to put God in a place where it makes him look darker. It makes him look emptier. It makes him look more powerless. And that's only because of our viewpoint. It's all about viewpoint. So number 3, write this down. We need to know this. When facing giants, do we see what God sees? What you see is not always how things really are. When you're facing a giant, what you see is not how things really are. They just appear that way because of where we stand. When you adopt a view that says what I see is not how things are, and you transpose yourself to the spiritual reality in spite of the visual reality, now you're ready to become a slingshot and a stone in the hands of God. And God will always give you a trophy, so that the next time you run into a bigger giant, you can be reminded of how great God is. So if there's any giants in your life today causing you to be afraid, know this. Your God, my God, he's a giant slayer. And he gives us the victory. Amen?